Hello, welcome to Penstroke Anatomy, and in this video we are going to cover one of the branches of the abdominal aorta, and this is the celiac trunk. Now, the celiac trunk is the first unpaired branch of the abdominal aorta, and it arises just underneath the arcuate, the median arcuate ligament of the diaphragm. Now, in this video we're going to cover that in depth, so let's get straight into it. First of all, several disclaimers. If you have done any dissections or if you have looked at the cadaveric material in your universities, etc., you would probably see that this is not the case in most donors, right? First of all, the liver kind of covers this part, and here we have reflected the lower edge of the liver upwards, and you basically see the lower surface of the liver, hence the gallbladder is very visible, right? The point of the arrows is that they signify that the liver has been kind of partially reflected. Now, even if you reflect the liver, you're still not going to see this area here. This is not readily available. This small crevice, this small space here, is known as the minor omental bursa, and this is part of peritoneal compartment. If you need some help with peritoneal compartments, we can make another video on that. If you're interested, if you want it, just write it in the comments. Second of all, even if you open the peritoneal bursa, which in this case is covered by a small sheet of peritoneum which extends in between the liver and the stomach along with the duodenum, right? This part is covered by a thin peritoneal sheet. Even if you transect that sheet and open it up, you're not going to see straight away these guys here because they're underneath the posterior sheet of the peritoneum, right? Oops, move the camera, sorry. Yep. In general, if you dissect everything, if you remove the peritoneum and if you reflect the liver, this is what you're going to see. But this is not what's by default in a human body. All of these things are kind of highly covered. So, having said that, let's get straight into the anatomy of the celiac trunk. As you can see, it has quite a bit of branches. But all of those small arteries can be traced to one of these three original main branches of the celiac trunk. And these are the common hepatic artery, which goes towards the liver, the splenic artery going towards the spleen, of course, and the left gastric artery. Now, before we continue, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, the liver is green, yes, the spleen is green, and yes, this is because I am colorblind, and no, I'm not going to redraw it in order to make it brown. Okay, so, back to our celiac trunk. The common hepatic artery is one of the rather more complex arteries of this trunk, so we're going to go along this one first. Now, along the length, usually no branches would be present, and you would see that at some point, usually close to the liver, this one artery would split into two main branches, one going up and one going down, here 4 and 9, and these are the proper hepatic artery and the gastroduodenal artery. So if we have to just summarize, this is the common, because these two are together here, hepatic, and this is the proper hepatic because it supplies only the liver. And this one is known as gastroduodenal because, of course, it supplies the corresponding organs, right? So, let's start with the proper hepatic artery. What you're going to see is that this artery would split in two main branches again, and this is one branch for each of the liver lobes. One for the left lobe and one for the right lobe. Of course, this artery would be known as the left and right hepatic artery. From the right hepatic artery, a small branch would deviate, and that would end up supplying the gallbladder, and this is the so-called cystic artery. Now, we mentioned that one of the main vessels of the celiac trunk, this is the left gastric artery. The right gastric artery would come either from the common or from the proper hepatic arteries and would continue along the minor curve of the stomach as well, and those guys would interconnect, right? Forming a nice small loop along the small curvature of the stomach, and from here a lot of small branches will arise supplying the abdominal walls. A disclaimer, again, this is not the picture that you're going to see in all of the dissections. This is how it's usually drawn on atlases, but sometimes these guys are not necessarily being connected like that, right? They still are making anastomosis, but this anastomosis may not happen through the main branches, but through their secondary or tertiary branches, so they would be much less pronounced, but it would be still functionally present. Okay. These are the main players here. One interesting thing is that I did mention that you have peritoneal sheath going through this area, right? And usually in that peritoneal sheath, not usually, but in peritoneal sheaths in general, this double layer of peritoneal sheaths, you have the arteries go in between those double layers. Now, if you want one more precise explanation, you can check our next video on the mesenteric arteries, which again is in the link below or at the end of the video. But the general idea is that this cystic artery goes along with the biliary ducts, so they are kind of quite close and parallel together in this peritoneal sheath. And of course, during surgical procedures, if you want to remove the gallbladder, both of those arteries and biliary ducts should be clamped in order to prevent the bleeding or bile, I don't know, effusion. Okay. Something else which, before we continue with the rest of the anatomy, is interesting is that you should remember that the right hepatic artery is very close to the extrabiliary system, extrabiliary duct. So in general, when you have such structures in anatomy which are close to each other, if something affects one of the structures, quite often the other structure is also affected. For example, if you have cancer of the hepatic vessels, the hepatic biliary vessels, these tumors can often invade the artery. And the other way around, if you have some, let's say, aneurysm of the artery here, the right hepatic artery, since you get this nice big bulge, not nice, but this big bulge in the artery, it could compress the bile ducts, leading to mechanical jaundice. So you can check those. This is called the hepatic artery compression syndrome. Okay, so the second main branch, which we discussed, is the gastroduodenal artery. This one, kind of, you can see you lose it out of sight here. It's because it slips in between the head of the pancreas and the duodenum like that, so you won't see it straight away. You lose it kind of out of your sight. But before it goes in, it usually gives two small branches here. One is the superior duodenal artery, which supplies part of the duodenum, and the other one is the superior pancreato-duodenal artery. Now you can see that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 arteries here, right? Some of them are branches of the gastro, some of them are branches of the superior mesenteric. In general, these 4 arteries are named pancreato-duodenal arteries, right? Pancreato-duodenal arteries. The ones that come from the top are superior, the ones that come from the bottom are inferior, the ones that are in front are anterior, the ones that are on the back are the posterior. So here you can make the names quite easily. The superior anterior pancreato-duodenal, the inferior anterior, the posterior inferior, and the posterior superior pancreato-duodenal arteries. And you can see how they interconnect with each other, so they kind of form this anastomosis. In general, they would supply the head of the pancreas, and here, of course, they would give branches for the duodenal wall. Now, something interesting that happens here, you can see that you have one quite large artery that goes from the pancreato-duodenal, from the gastroduodenal artery, right? Slips underneath, goes out, and follows the major curve of the stomach in this case, and connects with the artery coming from the splenic artery, like that, and forms again this nice big loop along the major curve, which highly resembles this loop here, right? And these two arteries are the left and right as well, again, like left, right, gastro-omental arteries, In some textbooks you can see them as gastroepiploic arteries. Doesn't matter which one you use, I think the gastromental is the newer term. But again, this would supply the major curve of the stomach. Now, just a sidetrack. You know that the minor curve is supplied by these guys, the major curve is supplied by these guys, right? But you can check out that from here you don't really have many arterial branches going towards the fundus of the stomach. So the fundus, this part of the stomach here, would be covered by several small, short arterial branches arising from the end of the splenic artery, either from the superior branch or from the end of the main trunk. And these several small branches are known as the short gastric arteries. And a branch again for the stomach, which I didn't draw here, but from here you sometimes can get a very small branch, not sometimes, you get a small branch which goes along the esophagus, supplying the esophagus, and this is a esophageal branch. Of course, these are quite fine, so I suppose you won't find them in your dissections unless you're very good at it. Okay, so I think these are the main features of these two arteries which we discussed. The last one that's left is the splenic artery, and the splenic artery, again, it runs behind the stomach. So you would see it on your prosections or dissections or whatever as a small, not a small, but as a big artery starting from the trunk and then slipping behind the stomach. At some point it exits behind the stomach and ends in the spleen. Usually it divides in, most often, in two main branches, the superior and inferior branch of the splenic artery, and they enter the hilum of the spleen, supplying it with blood, of course. Something that's quite peculiar, quite not normal, but quite how to put it, often seen in the splenic arteries, is that it makes a lot of loops. It either makes these kind of twists, or is just very, I don't know how to put it, loopy. Either way, it's very coiled, and in some individuals it can span up to 30 centimeters. So the length varies from 8 to 30 plus centimeters in most individuals. Along the length of the splenic artery, you would see 1, 2, 3 arteries diverging, 3 branches diverging toward the pancreas, and they supply the body and the tail of the pancreas. If you remember, the head was supplied by the mesenteric and gastroduodenal arteries, while the body would be, and the tail would be supplied, as I said, by the splenic artery. And you get this one, the first branch here is known as the dorsal, it's known as the dorsal pancreatic artery. Then you have the great pancreatic artery, and then you have your caudal pancreatic artery. And you can see how all of those are interconnected with each other, and even the dorsal pancreatic artery sends an anastomosing branch towards the head of the pancreas, getting connected with those guys here. So the entire pancreas is basically supplied by very, very densely interconnected arterial network. And that's in general your anatomy of the region. Now, if we have to summarize it, this celiac trunk would supply the organs that are located between the diaphragm, which would be, let's say, up here, and the transverse column, which would be down here. And this space between the diaphragm and the transverse column is known as the supracoeliac region, or compartment, not region. And this again is space in the peritoneal cavity. As I said, if you want a video on it, we can do one. And of course, the organs in that supracoeliac compartment are the liver with the gallbladder, the stomach, and the spleen. Right? So something that's quite interesting about the celiac trunk, let me get back our general schematic, is that it branches, as I said, just underneath the median ligament. And this median ligament, again, is basically a tendon. It's one of the tendons of the diaphragm, and it's quite dense, quite unstretchable, as most tendons are. And the interesting thing is that it can, of course, as with everything, it has variations, right? So it can branch up, it can branch down, so it depends on the person. The point is that if the celiac trunk and the ligament are quite close to each other, and basically the celiac trunk is kind of being ridden, it's by the ligament, by the median arcuate ligament, it can get compressed, especially during mid-expiration, where they kind of get close together and the ligament pushes on the celiac trunk, or the celiac trunk pushes against the ligament. I don't know how you're going to, most likely the ligament pushes on over the celiac trunk, get compressed, and this would lead to a ischemic conditions of the organs which are being supplied by it, right? And at this point, you know which organs are those. This is something that's known as the celiac trunk compression syndrome. It's very rare. I don't believe, trust me, you won't see this in your everyday practice. But again, if you go over and look over the symptoms, you can see, based on the anatomy of the celiac trunk and the supplied organs, that some of them would kind of make sense. It's mostly kind of, they're mostly very unspecific symptoms like general abdominal pain, and that's mainly because of these transitory ischemic conditions. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. Keep in mind that you have several variations, like this guy here, the right coeliac artery, the right gastric artery, it can branch either from here, or from here, or from here. So this one I decided to draw it like that. But again, the celiac trunk has some variations to it. These branching patterns as well, you can get some, like in the kidneys, if you remember the arteries, the liver is divided into segments, so you can get some segmental arteries which can branch from here or either directly from the aorta, etc. So it is not set in stone, but what you see here is one of the most common patterns. Let's say it would cover 90% of the people, and from there it's up to you to distinguish the variations, and that's very important, mainly during surgery, right? Because, how to put it, you need to sometimes snip or don't snip something, and if that something is not in its normal position, mistakes might happen. So these variations are quite important for surgeons. So thank you for watching, thank you for the attention. Write in the comments what you liked, what you didn't like the video or dislike it, tell me what you want to be improved. I will see if I can improve it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Until our next video, goodbye.